Welcome back. As I was saying, please continue enjoying your lunch. This is our third and final panel of this year's Global Social Justice Research Symposium. I'm Bill Cesato, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Center for Research and Fellowships. I have the opportunity at the center to work along with Lauren Tuckley, who's our director, as well as colleagues Colleen Doherty, whom you met earlier today, and Fatima Smith. We love celebrating and supporting undergraduate research and faculty and staff mentorship, and we are so grateful to be here today. Our third panel includes students representing 3 different named fellowships. Our first Hoya researcher, Anya Wahal, is a Provost Distinguished Undergraduate Research Fellow. This fellowship is designed to enhance student engagement in rigorous scholarly research. Students who are accepted to this competitive fellowship program are the highest rated applicants to the center's 3 other summer research programs and successfully complete an interview process. Anya, please.
Hi everyone, can you hear me okay? Okay, awesome. Hi everyone, my name is Anya. I'm a senior in the School of Foreign Service studying STEA, or Science, Technology, and International Affairs, concentrating in energy and the environment and minoring in Mandarin Chinese. I am also an environmental researcher, storyteller, and activist dedicated to understanding and amplifying voices disproportionately impacted by environmental crises. This summer, with the support of the Provost Fellowship, I returned to my home state of Arizona to work on research close to my heart. As many of you might know, Arizona, and the West more broadly, is currently experiencing an unprecedented drought. This drought has been particularly devastating for farmers, whose income and very livelihood depends on a steady supply of water. After the announcement of the water shortage earlier this year, I began on my research journey. This journey was defined by a fundamental question: what would a Tier 1 water shortage mean for my state? When the shortage was announced, it seemed as if every state media outlet and many national media outlets were flooded with the news. My initial background research revealed that the shortage meant that the Central Arizona Project, or CAP, Arizona's single largest source for renewable water, would experience a substantial cut in its share of the Colorado River. And while a Tier 1 shortage wouldn't yet impact ordinary Arizona residents like myself, the shortage would have disproportionate impacts on some communities more than others. In fact, in a state in which over 25% of Arizona residents were already experiencing severe drought, these water cuts would disproportionately impact farmers. Pinal County, Arizona's #1 producer for cotton, barley, and livestock, in red on the map, would be hardest hit. Other counties, like Maricopa County, were also concerned, given their high investments in business development and growth. After initial calls with experts, I soon discovered that the Tier 1 shortage was only the beginning of a statewide and even basin-wide sustainability challenge. The state was already planning for Tier 2 and even Tier 3 shortages, which would impact residents and development plans, the extent of which would be particularly difficult to manage due to Arizona's position as one of the fastest-growing states in the country. So I decided to frame my research to be future-oriented by asking the following question: how can Arizona policymakers more sustainably manage the Central Arizona Project, or CAP, given record water cuts, continued agricultural needs, and rapid development? To answer this question, this study included a 2-part analysis. First, a media analysis to understand how news outlets frame the Tier 1 shortage. Second, ethnography and qualitative methods to investigate the perceptions of farmers and politicians on the water crisis through interviews and participant observation. Why these methods? A media analysis would allow me to compare how water was talked about in Arizona and the Colorado River Basin and outside it. An ethnographic study supplemented with qualitative methods would provide a unique opportunity for me to interview stakeholders affected by water and involved in decision-making about water. In combination, these insights, I hoped, would prove useful to policymakers. First, I conducted my media analysis, the purpose of which was to investigate national and local news coverage of CAP and water shortages in Arizona. I selected news articles 5 months before and after the shortage was announced, and included search terms like the Central Arizona Project and water in the ProQuest News and Newspapers database, a common search engine for content analysis. A total of 167 news articles were found within this time frame. To analyze this data, I employed a deductive framing analysis, a method that relies on predefined news frames based on a previous study. The results indicated that the way in which news articles from organizations inside Arizona framed the crisis in comparison to news articles from organizations outside did so was significantly different in terms of the frequency of attributing responsibility and describing economic consequences, but not for other media frames such as human interest. This same trend appeared when comparing organizations inside and outside the Colorado River Basin. In addition, however, t-tests indicated that there was also a significant difference between how newspapers outside and inside the basin used the conflict frame. Together, these findings showcase the frequency organizations inside and outside Arizona in the basin fit within certain frameworks over others. Not only that, but they show which frames are significantly different depending on the newspaper's publication origin, a finding useful as policymakers continue to strive to understand how the public is perceiving water shortages. After completing my media analysis, I then proceeded to conduct my ethnography and qualitative analysis, which comprised of interviews and participant observation. The pictures you see above include footage from this process. The requirements for inclusion to be interviewed included A, identification as a farmer, rancher, policymaker, or politician, and B, an involvement in Maricopa and/or Pinal County agriculture or policy operations. The total number of interviews amounted to 60, with interviews with farmers and ranchers totaling to 29, and interviews with policymakers and politicians totaling to 31. Each interview lasted between 30 to 90 minutes. After facilitating these interviews and transcribing them, I analyzed them for key themes and began developing a living codebook. I also conducted participant observation for 2 weeks in Arizona, visiting farms, doing follow-up interviews, and meeting politicians. This observation provided me with additional data for my study. While the ethnography and qualitative analysis portion of my study has not yet been finalized, for my initial review of my data and coding of themes, I'd like to share 3 key insights that I hope will inform policymaking on water shortages in the future. First, the conversation surrounding agriculture and development must be reframed in order for policy to achieve its objectives. The conversation currently stems from the perspective that agriculture is against growth and development, and vice versa. The common phrase in the West, "whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting," encapsulates this conflict. Although conversations from farmers do reveal some resentment against unqualified development, opinions tend to be more nuanced in practice. In fact, as one farmer I interviewed put it, "I'm not against development, I'm just against how we're going about it. They just want to build the cheapest house possible." Focusing on who is angered by development and why they're angry about it sheds crucial light on how to build a more sustainable and inclusive path forward. Second, progressive environmentalists in Arizona have often made arguments that a city like Phoenix shouldn't exist in the first place because it is a desert, after all. But this point is moot because obviously Phoenix already does exist and it won't stop existing. In fact, it is one of the fastest growing cities in the country and a hub for business and development, as you can see from these pictures comparing Phoenix in 1950 to Phoenix today. Building cities in the desert has also long been a tradition of the human race. From the Nile to the Tigris and Euphrates, human civilization has long thrived in the desert. Accepting that Phoenix and other cities in Arizona will continue to grow is a crucial step in ensuring they can do so sustainably. Third, I found that many reasonable citizens and policymakers are demanding that farmers make their businesses more sustainable. However, while investments in sustainable agriculture would represent significant progress, demanding this change without providing the necessary support would lead to less than ideal outcomes. Such demands make farmers out to be the villains when the truth is far less clear-cut. In a field visit I conducted, for instance, one farmer mentioned that she wanted to switch over to more sustainable crops, like agave here on the right, from more water-intensive ones like alfalfa here on the left. But she simply didn't have the financial resources or labor to make that change. And when I asked if government grants existed to help her, she said that they didn't, and any help that was offered by nonprofits wasn't nearly enough to cover the costs. This sentiment wasn't specific to just one farmer. It was widespread. If Arizona aims to maintain its agricultural traditions, support farming businesses, and clear new development, it must make a more conscious effort to include farming perspectives in that process. While this study has not yet been completed, my ultimate hope is that its novel findings on the perceptions of water shortages in Arizona will enable policymakers to make more holistic and informed decisions on water policy. After all, water is essential to survival, but because its allocation and availability varies across regions and populations, a trend that will only become more severe due to climate change, Efficient management has never become more urgent. My research is a testament to that very fact. Lastly, I just want to thank the CSJ for allowing me to present today, and for Professor Giordano for advising on this project, as well as to Professor Mendenhall for being an amazing SIA thesis professor, and obviously to Bill and Colleen as well for supporting me throughout this entire process, as well as the Provost Fellowship more broadly. I'm looking forward to any questions, and thank you so much for listening.
Anya, thank you so much. The next research project comes to us from Asma Shakil and Huda Syed, seniors at our Georgetown in Qatar campus, who work together as Lisa J. Raines Fellows. Lisa Raines graduated from Georgetown Law in 1982 and was a leader in the biotechnology field, seeking to advance treatments for cancer, HIV/AIDS, and rare diseases. She perished on September 11, 2001, aboard American Airlines Flight 77, and this fellowship at Georgetown honors her legacy and steadfast work to contribute to the common good. During the summer, Raines Fellows conduct independent research and participate in a weekly seminar. We are grateful that Asma and Huda can join us via Zoom today from Georgetown's campus in Doha. Asma and Huda.
So, hello everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I am Huda, and I am an international economics junior at Georgetown University Qatar campus. And with me is Asma, who is also who's an international history junior at Georgetown University Qatar. The research project that we are presenting today came into existence as a response to the grand challenge of global mobility posed by Lisa J. Raines Summer Fellowship 2020. In response to this challenge, we came up with a research project titled Forced Migration and Immobility. The title that you see on your screen, Coming a Full Circle, Analyzing the 2 Years of Hiatus in India Through Migrants in Premnagar, is actually the title of our research paper, which was the final product of our summer-long research. Before we even start about explaining what the research was and how we worked through it, we'd like to thank Lisa J. Raines Fellowship for giving us this opportunity, for Professor Uday Chandra for being an amazing mentor throughout, Bill and Colleen for being such wonderful coordinators, and every other Raines Fellow awardee. All of you made this experience really wonderful for us. Also, we'd like to dedicate this project to the migrant workers in India who let us into their stories and without whom this project would not have come into existence. Now, contents. I believe you can see this screen, and as you can see on this screen are some pretty fancy titles which we also opted for our research paper, and you can see clearly in the screen that the creative side of the history major in the group overpowered the economic major. But just to give you the basis of what this, how we have divided the presentation and our research paper is first the introduction, which will give you an idea to how the migrant crisis in India started, what was the reason behind it. Second section will talk about the data and research methodology that we've employed. The third section tries to understand the theories that already exist in this field and how we can situate the crisis of Indian migrant workers in that context. The fourth section actually analyzes the policy response of the government, and the fifth section tries to understand media narratives about the same. What was the media narrative? What was the popular narrative? How it impacted migrant workers on ground. Finally, the last section of the presentation is pretty important. It's lived realities of migrant populace of Premnagar, which actually provides the much deserved space to these individuals who we have interviewed throughout the process. At this point, I'd like Asma to take over.
Thank you so much, Huda. I hope I'm really loud and you can hear me. So I'll just give you a brief context exactly what happened and where exactly is our research question situated in all of this. So on 23rd March 2020, the central government of India, like most world governments, imposed a nationwide lockdown in response to the outbreak of the then novel COVID-19 virus. Following the Prime Minister's call for a people's curfew, domestic borders, transport facilities like interstate buses, trains, and flights flights were discontinued. Thousands of international and internal migrant workers who had called Delhi and other metropolitan cities their home and had relied on informal and daily wages found themselves on the streets, out of job, food, and shelter. In the light of this growing insecurity and distress among the workers, our project is an ethnographic fieldwork that we conducted to analyze the migrant crisis in India. Next slide, Huda. Thank you. So we have three main research questions that our paper seems to sort of analyze. The first one is, how did the sudden halt of mobility and nationwide lockdown impact the lived realities of Indian migrant laborers? Number two, we analyze how objectively did the Indian media represent its subaltern in the crisis? And thirdly, and finally, what were the consequences of the government policy response to these domestic crises at hand? We revisit this recent moment in history, and our research aims to highlight the continuity in the lack of socio-economic and political responsibility of governments towards its subaltern in crisis. So as far as the data and research methodology is concerned, we have a similar approach that Anya, the Provost's distinguished scholarship, just now informed us about her project. So ours is more of an ethnographic field work, wherein first of all, we analyze 15 qualitative, both structured and unstructured interviews, whereby the interviewees were sort of selected through random and snowball sampling methods, all of which were migrant workers who had based themselves in West Delhi regions of Karampura and Premnagar. The second analysis is the use of media content and policy analysis, where we used to examine the objectivity or lack thereof of the news channels covering in the nationwide lockdown. So for this specific methodology, we analyzed three ideologically opposing news agencies in India, rightist, centrist, and leftists, and compared how visible the migration crisis of India was in these news channels. Next slide, Huda. Exactly. So the third section of our paper, which is essentially based on theories of migration, it is trying to understand the scholarship on migration as to what are one of the fewest and most recent theories that explained why people migrate from rural and semi-urban areas to urban areas. So for this section, I would have to go in depth and try to bore you, but I'll try not to do that, because the foremost reason for this is because first of all, we need to understand that historically, migratory studies and migration studies has tried to understand migration as only international and linear, meaning that circular and domestic migration has been more or less ignored from the literature. And as such, we identified in our paper that neoclassical model, new economies of migration, and dual market labor theory alone cannot help us understand the crux or give us a full picture of the situation at hand. As a result, we came to two main conclusions. Number one, there is an adequate literature existent on how circular migration in India works. This is because everybody assumes that international migration is the most important aspect of migratory routes in India, which is not very true. In fact, most of the remittances and number of people who migrate from India are those who migrate from villages of Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, and Rajasthan internally to the country's capital, Delhi. And the second conclusion that we came about in this paper is that there is a lack of statistical data in terms of how many people migrate and the kind of remittances that they indulge in. This is something that we agree with the existing scholarship, that is Priya Dishankar, who is the foremost scholar of Indian migration. She postulates that because the government has not put in place any such databases as European agencies have, that we are not able to get a full sense of the picture, because of which most of the policies do not sort of work hand in hand with the reality on the ground. So those are two main conclusions that we draw on our section of theories of migration.
This brings us to the next section, which practically was to analyze the policy response of the union government or the central government to these crises in hand. Now, I might add over here like a periodic labor force survey conducted in 2017 to 2018 by Government of India suggested that of all the workers that work in India, only 70%, 71% of them do not have any form of formal job contracts, and around 50% of them do not have the provision of paid leave or any form of social benefit. That means an impromptu lockdown was meant to unleash crisis for workers in general and migrant workers in particular. Now, the initial response, what was the response of the central government to these crises? Now, the initial response that we see of the central government was to completely shift the responsibility to the state governments and ask them to utilize state disaster response fund to establish food distribution centers, housing shelters, and transportation facilities in order to ensure that these migrants stay in place and the lockdown is imposed properly. But from our research, when we interview these migrant workers and we asked them about these facilities available, there was three main points that they highlighted. Firstly, they said that these these centers of distribution for food or generally housing shelters were very far away from regions that they work in, and they had to walk long miles to get there. That was the first point. And second point was like for food distribution centers, they had to wait in long queues and long lines to get food. And they said that the distribution was based on a more first come first serve basis, and there was no guarantee that by the end of the day they'll still get food. And the third important factor that they highlighted was that there was a persistent fear of police brutality, as the police were adamant in implementing lockdown policies. So they said that they never thought it was worth enough risking to walk that much miles every day to get food and to risk police brutality. And at the end, they weren't even sure that they'll be getting food. So we clearly see that among these state policies, we see a lack of implementation and implementation error arising. This migrant worker crisis also highlighted another important flaw that was in the already existing public distribution centers. Like according to the currently existing public distribution centers, workers or generally people living near the poverty line get a card, a ration card through which they can access subsidized grains and subsidized food items. But what happened was migrant workers had their addresses registered to their native places and hence could not access these food grains or subsidized items in metropolises or other cities, which was another important big loophole in this whole system. Third was that even though the state tried to provide bus facilities and other forms to transport some of these migrant workers back to their native places because they did not have enough wages to survive them in their current working areas, what happened is like most of them said that these facilities were also not accessible and most of them did not know how to get them. I remember one of the interviewers that we interviewed, he said that he had to pay like 6,000 INR, which is too much for a daily wage worker, to just get on the back of a truck who could transport him back to his village. That's how severe the conditions for these migrant workers were. Finally, on 1st of May, which is celebrated as Labour's Day, the Prime Minister announced the Shramik trains or special trains to transport these individuals, these migrant workers from metropolises to their native places. Now, the irony of this whole thing remains that the propagation or the information that about these Shramik trains were disseminated through online portals, through Twitter or through Facebook. Now, the population that we are considering over here, a majority of them are not literate enough to use these sources. Therefore, the very means through which this information was disseminated alienated these migrant workers because they did not know how to access or where to get the tickets. Now, we cannot imagine a migrant worker who works a daily wage to really go to Twitter and say, oh, they have announced it on Twitter and now I know how to book my tickets. So it's impossible for them. Also, when it comes to Prime Minister for schemes or other schemes that said that they'll give direct transfer to these migrant workers, the migrant workers on ground, which we interviewed, complained that there was not a uniformity about the amount that you receive. Some had received amounts as low as mere 500 rupees to some getting 5,000 rupees. And they said that this was not a consistent process, like they did not receive direct transfers on regular basis. They would receive it once, twice, and that's all. And the distribution is not at all uniform. So that remains a loophole in policy implementation of both state and center government. This brings me to the next section of how the media presented the views of these individuals and whether they were represented or not. Now, as Asma already mentioned, that we analyzed NDTV, India Today, and Republic India, which are like three very varying news channels in India. NDTV being the leftist media outlet, and I might say like one of the very few leftist remaining ones. Majority of the media industry currently is more right-leaning or more center. And we see that what these media outlets did through their breaking news, through their highlights, is to create the idea that migrant workers are actually diseased, and they intensified or strengthened the disease migrant tropes by just saying that these people are a hazard to everybody because they're coming out on roads and are not respecting the lockdown policies. Therefore, they're not only posing threat to themselves, but generally to the whole nation. And what was common among media news channels and what was prominent topic of discussion was whether these poor people were deserving of aid and deserving of help or not. And by saying that these people are violating lockdowns and therefore these people are putting the nation at risk, and hence they're anti-nationals, So this was the whole idea and the discussion that was promoted, and media was clearly biased towards these individuals, at least the majority media in India. Now, this brings us to the next section, which I said was the very important one, and that is lived realities of migrant populace of Premnagar. Asma?
Yeah, this is our last section, so I'll be very quick because I know we've taken a lot of time because we are two of us. So first of all, in this section of the paper, we talk about something that we did not sort of understand from the literature or from the media analysis. This is based on our conversations with the interviewees, and we got to know that there is a dominant, and there was, and still remains, a dominant sense of otherness amongst these migrant workers. They felt that they were not involved in the decision-making of the processes, and something that came up again and again was this idea that they thought that migrant population specifically believed that the COVID-19 virus was a disease of the rich. What they meant by this is because when, and this is me paraphrasing an interviewee, is that since COVID-19 virus originated in countries abroad, and Indians traveling to abroad countries who were, according to them, very rich, came back to the country with the disease, the government only catered to these to these rich individuals, and as such imposed a nationwide lockdown without taking into account that most of the population is a daily wage earner. And for them, a nationwide lockdown with the 4 hours notice is not enough for them to understand the issues at hand. And with that, we leave to you this question that whether or not COVID-19 pandemic is a disease of rich. Of course, we believe as intellectuals, as people who believe in science, that it's not a disease of the rich. But why is it that governments, specifically of India, declared a nationwide lockdown suddenly out of nowhere with no announcements for people who belong to the lower sections of the society? And more specifically, why is it that this disease, or specifically COVID-19, released a renewed sense of obsession for India with cleanliness? Now, I'm not saying, and we're not arguing in the paper, that sanitization is not important, but what we're saying based on our interviewees is that sanitization, which has a rich legacy of India's casteism, is something that deep-rooted and renewed the idea of caste and pathological differences which are ontologically understood to be associated with the caste and classes which are of the lower sections. So in short, our argument essentially is about how people and migrant workers felt throughout the exodus. They felt that they were not sort of taken into consideration when producing laws, and generally the theories of migration and media were very much adequate to understand the whole picture. And with that, I think we come to our conclusion, and we would be more than happy to answer any questions that you might have, taken into consideration that you could at least hear us.
Thank you, Asma and Huda. Colleen and I had such a wonderful time working with you and the Raines Fellows during our seminar this summer. Our final Hoya researcher today is Carrie O'Donnell, a senior in the Walsh School of Foreign Service. Through the David F. Andretta MD Explorer Fund, a rising senior conducts research on a social justice research issue anywhere in the world during the summer. David Andretta was a double Hoya, the class of 1999 of Georgetown College and the class of 2004 of the School of Medicine. He was an adventurous soul and a true Hoya for others. Throughout his 31 years of life, David enthusiastically explored the world. David was a loving son, husband, brother, mentor, and friend, known for his hard work ethic and zest for life. And his legacy is embraced and extended by each successive fellowship recipient. Carrie, please come up.
Can everybody hear me? Okay, perfect. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for coming out. My name is Carrie O'Donnell, and I was lucky enough to be selected as the CSJ's 2022 Andretta Fellow, as Bill said. I also want to start by congratulating all my fellow panelists, because all the work you've done is just mind-blowingly incredible, and I'm so honored to be presenting alongside you. And of course, a massive, massive thank you to the Andretta family. Let's begin. This is Monhegan Island, Maine. Scarcely a square mile in area, it's located 12 miles off the state's midcoast, where it can be reached only by an hour-long ferry that, in the winter, runs only when the raucous swells see it fit. There are no paved roads and one single grocery store. One of the businesses only got electricity in 2016, as trying to ensure kerosene lamps was becoming, quote, too much of a chore. I could go on. And its stark cliffs, wildflower meadows, and red sunsets have enchanted a seasonal artist colony for centuries. While Monhegan boasts a year-round population of 69 according to the census, everyone on the island knows it's closer to 50. From May to October, the dirt roads and bare clapboard houses flood with visitors and seasonal laborers from all over. And in mid-October, most businesses shutter their doors, and the islanders largely trade in customer service gigs for setting lobster traps down in the sea. I've lived on Monhegan off and on for the past 3 years, since my older sister became the head teacher at the island's one-room schoolhouse in 2020. It's an incredibly beautiful, complex, and sometimes wild place. I honestly really struggle to find the words to do it justice here. But the more I involve myself with this singular community, the more I realize that not only are the Maine outer islands critically understudied, but also that the current moment represents a vital juncture in terms of Monhegan's sustainability. The Gulf of Maine is the most rapidly warming water body in the world, and its effects are widely felt, especially within the lobstering industry on Maine islands. As well, on Maine islands, the price of goods like groceries can be upwards of 3 times as expensive as on the mainland, where we already face unprecedented inflation, as you can see here. These challenges, though certainly escalating now, symbolize a continuous trend. Pre-1900, there were over 300 year-round outer island communities in the Gulf of Maine. Now, they number only 15, as I've indicated here with the black pins. It's common knowledge among islanders that Maine island communities are disappearing. Every islander I spoke to was keenly aware of this pressing history, as if it lived within them. Though there is commendable work being done in island communities to sustain their unique cultures themselves, I found little support or inquiry from the mainland, especially from the Academy. I thought the Andretta Fellowship could be an opportunity to try and elevate that local knowledge, to bring inshore the reality that islanders have faced for centuries. With this, I kind of approached my research as a whodunit, a kind of excavation of the Maine islands. What had happened to those that had disappeared? And how did islands like Monhegan avoid that same fate? Could islanders' remembrance contribute to their resilience? And what did this mean for the future? My methodology was threefold. I trawled archives for means of seeing islands past within their context. I conducted in-person and online oral history interviews to both assess islanders' connection to the past and their vision of the future. And I gleaned daily field observations from the island experience itself. Being a comparative study, my investigations of the year-round communities that had since gone extinct, ghost islands, as I called them, were mostly archival. Though unfortunately many of these islands were lost even to memory, I was able to locate some archives and still living former islanders with the help of the Island Institute, a nonprofit dedicated to preserving Maine's working waterfronts. I worked with historical societies, libraries, museums galore to extract accounts of island living in the past century and records of the island communities that had since gone extinct. Of these ghost islands, the most recent had lost its year-round population in the 1980s. And with the help of the archives, I was actually able to hunt down and interview its last living year-round resident, which was just amazing. My qualitative data for living islands was largely gathered from interviews. While I collected 18 in total, 6 were from islands other than Monhegan, 9 were from Monhegan proper, and the remaining 3 had spent time on both Monhegan and another Maine island. Overall, my major concern was that Maine islanders are largely pretty wary of outsider prodding, and a few of those I interviewed had already had negative experiences with the press. In particular, Monhegan made the cover of National Geographic in 2001, and some told me they were misquoted and portrayed unfaithfully as a way of further exoticizing the island. To ensure the participants' comfort and sense of safety in the interview process, I sought to approach them in context as much as possible. And this doubled as my fieldwork observations. I interviewed people while squid fishing in kayaks, on trail walks, and over the nightly clamor at the local brewery, if that's what they desired. Those who wanted total privacy, well, as total as is possible in such a tiny community where gossip is gospel, met me in my kitchen, and I made them tea while reading aloud the consent form. With the tight-knit kin networks endemic to a place like Monhegan, my concern as a researcher lies in everyone feeling safe to share openly without igniting any tension. These, after all, were my friends, neighbors, employers, coworkers, with whom I shared such a small, special place, an entire community to keep me accountable. But what was it exactly that I found? The first thing, Maine Outer Islands face extinction in the present and past, in part because of its place within the inshore imagination. The island as a cultural institution is suffering a kind of social death, where it is treated as no more than a relic, a memory, a curio. Memory rules and preempts the present, even as communities fight to remain. In other words, non-islanders often don't consider Maine Islands real places, which makes the communities suffer in turn. For instance, island school teachers often complain of visitors barging into their classrooms at random during the school year, not having realized that the island school is, in fact, still a public school. The ghost islands I researched often suffered slow, halting deaths, fueled by a premature insistence from outside forces that the community was a lost cause. Waves of islands died in post-war eras, where resources provided by the state, especially in education, housing, and transportation, were cut. Younger generations were drafted into service and found support on the mainland more plentiful than if they would decide to return home with their children. In the mid-20th century, intra- and inter-island conflicts over informal lobstering territory made opportunities for mainlanders to move onto islands scarce. Monhegan historically avoided these pitfalls, I found, due to its collectivist heterogeneous culture, which I believe comes from two main sources: its singular artist colony, which regularly refreshed social dynamics and funneled in essential resources, and its lobstering system, which creates solidarity off of a shortened season and one shared dock. While Monhegan's unique, interdependent ecosystem kept it afloat in the past, today's landscape offers unseen challenges. That resilient, heterogeneous culture still undoubtedly runs through the island's veins, but I find that the temporary interest is being increasingly leveraged over the future. And this has fostered an unsustainable infrastructure. This is tied most intimately to the tourist industry, which fuels the especially controversial short-term rental market. I talked to year-round islanders that are currently living in tents and on boats as a means of alternative housing in summer, as the vacation market has hiked up the average rent on Monhegan to about $2,500 per week in the on-season, with other islands looking at even steeper costs. To even remotely survive, islanders must work with tourist industries more than ever, juggling 3 or 4 jobs at a minimum and experiencing unprecedented burnout while still relying wholly on seasonal visitors for both housing and income. Seasonal stakeholders, meanwhile, often hope to foster a positive relationship with islanders while prioritizing their profit motive. The power imbalances, the two conflicting imaginaries of the island, become very stark in this light. Outer island communities, especially Monhegan, have an inextricable relationship to the past, I found, and feel its ghosts in much more pronounced ways than we do here inshore. Those I interviewed who had left the main islands decades prior still expressed a kind of metaphysical connection to islandness, even if their island community no longer existed. Remembrance is a double-edged sword for the main island, that it draws people to preserve the past, and, at the same time, sometimes stalls islands from embracing long-term community planning. Something almost every one of my interviewees asserted, though, was that Monhegan and other islands' current challenges would not spell their end. They were adamant that the island would survive as it had in the past, even if they all agreed the circumstances were more dire than they had been in the past, and noted that Monhegan, like many islands, represents a societal microcosm of sorts, a prism refracting our current moment and perhaps what lies ahead. Island time has the cultural reputation of signifying something unhurried and out of step with the mainland. For me, I think it's something much greater. Islands can throw time at you non-linearly, joining past, present, and occasionally almost oracular future. For instance, when I saw the headlines of E. coli due to a water crisis in Jackson, Mississippi a few weeks ago, it echoed when we all boiled water for months on Monhegan this summer for the exact same reason. When I look at Airbnb exploding housing markets in coastal cities, I think of my island friends and their young families that have moved 20 times in the past 4 years to keep a house over their head and remain on the island. If islands can show us the future, though, investment in them can mean a path forward for all of us. There is real comfort, I find, in knowing to look to the islands, and for me, in knowing to look to Monhegan. Thank you so much, everybody, for all of your support, especially another thank you to the Andretta family and everybody at the CSJ. Also, if anyone is further interested in exploring this topic further, either come talk to me. I'm really happy to field all your questions, or consider looking up the Island Institute or MISCA, which is the Monhegan Island Sustainable Community Organization. A really great thank you to all of my islanders as well, who hopefully are also on the Zoom call. Thank you so much, everybody.
Carrie, first off, thank you so much. And thank you to Anya, Asma, Huda, and again, Carrie, for your wonderful presentations. We have about 15 minutes for questions for our Hoya researchers. For those here in the room, as we've been doing today, please raise your hand and use the mic that is brought to you. Zoom attendees, please put your questions in the chat room and they will be asked aloud here. For our panelists at the table, as you're answering questions, please make sure that your microphones are on. So, who has a question for our researchers? Yes.
Hello to our researchers, and hello to our researchers in Qatar. Thank you so much for presenting today. It struck me that you all conducted research on a community that was very close to home to you. So this is for anyone who would like to start. But what did it feel like to separate yourself as a researcher in that moment as you were studying a community that you clearly very much cared about? And maybe we could start with our fellows and students in Qatar. If you'd like to start. Thank you.
Okay, so I think that's a great question. Thank you for asking. Here I'll be shamelessly promoting Lisa J. Raines Fellowship, because during our weekly seminars, we used to hold, we used to host panelists, and we used to discuss things like research methodologies and tactics that can help us to be more objective. And in one of those weekly seminars, we discussed the concept of reflexivity, where you sort of take a step back and analyze where you come from when you analyze your research question, and whether or not you can have certain biases or subjectivities towards this. And since Huda and I, we are both Kashmiris, and our view about India is very antagonistic, and as such, our project was also very antagonistic, because migrant population in India was also very negative or pessimistic about the Indian government. So you cannot really be objective with your project, but it's fine to have biases, but you have to have facts to support your biases, because it is your factual, qualitative, and quantitative data that speaks for you. So with that being said, of course, you need to step back and put yourself in the shoes of the people who are going through certain things. This can be sometimes politicians, where are the policies coming from, but also the migrant workers when they are asking for certain reforms in the policies. So for us, and sometimes this is because Huda and I, we are best friends, roommates, and we have done things together since very long time, we used to ask questions to each other whether or not these made sense. Like, is this conclusion factually supported? And most importantly, we had the support of our mentor, who's an expert in Indian Ocean studies, and we used to confirm our understandings and our findings. But that being said, it really comes down to the facts that your research has produced. And with that, you can go ahead and make your conclusions, which are supported through the statistics. I hope that answers. I would love to hear what my other panelists have to say on this.
For me, it was a little different because, yes, I am from Arizona, but there were a lot of people who I met who I'd never been to that part of Arizona before. I found that Arizona is very siloed. Growing up, we sort of only spent time in the city and in the suburbs and never really went as far as a lot of these farms are. Except to sometimes go to national parks like the Grand Canyon. And so this was a little bit like exploring my home in a way that I'd never explored it before, sort of seeing it through a new light in that way. And from
the farmers' perspectives especially, it was also, I think, a new experience. I think I was the first Asian person that most of them had ever seen or met in their life. And so there were a lot of questions about that. And for them, it was a very new and different experience as well. I think that allowed me to keep it objective. Certainly, there were challenges. Most of the farmers who I met came from completely different political and social circumstances than I did. And so being able to keep an open mind and being able to connect as humans, not just as researchers, was, I think, really important. I think what allowed me to stay objective through that process was writing notes and being able to talk to people, but I've also found that my perspective and my biases, sort of like Asma was saying, also sort of grounded me in the sense that I knew that I wanted to learn their story. I was there as a listener. I was there as a guest, if you will, even though it was my own home state. And so I wanted to stay true and honor that position as a guest in their home.
Absolutely. I want to echo everything that all of my fellow panelists have said. Perfect. Okay. So I want to echo everything that my fellow panelists had said. For me, kind of extracting myself from literally an island where you are very much like geographically siloed, surrounded by either water or kind of a community that you're extremely already integrated in for the past couple years, for me was pretty difficult. I think what helped a lot was the comparative aspect of it, was pulling in other islands' experiences and also kind of having a comparison between past and present. There were certain very hot and button issues that people had a lot of very high tensions about, that I had to navigate, a lot of kind of intra-island tensions regarding either lobstering territory. There were lobster wars in the 1950s through 1970s that were actually very serious, and the children of the people on either side of lobster wars were still very much living. So trying to focus on maybe the more restorative, like healing aspects of the process, and also Monhegan, there's a saying that like your worst enemy will be the first to pull you out of the water. So almost leaning into that as like, okay, let's, even as we navigate these tensions in the past, and obviously these very valid emotions of what you felt, and especially in the case of the housing crisis, what you're currently facing. We leaned in a lot to gratitude and also to kind of that restorative reconstruction of relationships that happens a lot between islands and happens a lot within islands.
Thank you so much.
Hi, we have a question from the chat from Anne Oldenburg. For Carrie, who was the oldest person you interviewed, and what wisdom did that person share about the island life as is related to your research?
Ooh, yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Professor Oldenburg. I believe the oldest person I interviewed was in her early 80s. And she had been, she was from one of the ghost islands, Louds, off of the coast of Miscongas. That was actually kind of close to Monhegan, but had lost its year-round population in the 1970s and 80s. So she and her husband had lived there for the past, from 1975 when the school closed and when a lot of things started shutting down through the 80s. So they saw a lot of like the mass exodus from the island and that initial like death knell, and what had turned it from a year-round sustainable permanent community to essentially a seasonal fishing village. So listening to her entire story and what she could conjure was, I mean, it was incredible. And also the fact that I had found her in the first place, I just felt an immense amount of gratitude for being able to have her as a guest, like when he was saying, and having her in my space. But she, from kind of the past of the island, I gleaned that the 1970s were kind of an absolutely wild time in terms of a lot of social dynamics being totally tossed out and refreshed, in terms of islanders being drafted into the Vietnam War. And there was a lot of also like how protests and tensions within the islands coming off of those lobster wars kind of interacted with a very different tourist community, where tourists are obviously going there to like sit on the beach. Meanwhile, there are Vietnam protests with like the 12 people that currently live on the island happening in the street. So even just like gleaning those stories and like being able to hear and preserve those histories and pass it on to you all today it was a gift.
Yes.
Two more comments for Carrie. First of all, Harry would like to say that I know that Rockefellers contributed a lot to the development of Acadia National Park in Maine. Not sure if they contributed much to the Mohegan Island. Also, we and the Andretas are proud of your work and presentation. And here's a question for you from Melissa Andreta. First of all, awesome presentation, congratulations. What was the most challenging part of your research and how did you overcome it?
That is a great question. Thank you so much, Andretta family, for tuning in. That means so much to me. I would say the most challenging part was finding people in the first place, especially people in those past islands, just like having to narrow down from like, okay, there were 300 plus of these islands back then. Where can I find them in these atlases? Where can I find that there were actual records of people living here? And even going through the archives and considering, okay, my most frustrating part of the project would constantly be like, okay, this person was born in 1932, maybe I can find them. And then I would put their name into Google and the first thing would be an obituary from the past 2 years. It seems that we are at a massive just precipice of all of these island memories being forgotten or not necessarily being passed on by people who had lived there themselves and people who had been there for the entire year. So I think Monhegan was fairly, again, navigating the tensions was a little difficult, especially when it comes to housing issues. A lot of islanders also own property that they rent out, so that, like, obviously the renters versus the young islanders that are trying to actually like get a foothold in the community were two very different experiences, but being able to find them was nice, being able to track them down because I was in such a tiny little place and always knowing where they'd be, just that kind of information. You kind of get it by osmosis for, everybody's schedule. So I would say reaching out to other islands and also where this connectivity didn't exist.
I'd like to build off of that question because I was really struck during your presentation about how your work in the archives connected you with a participant in your work. And I was wondering if, since all of you engaged in an interview methodology, if Anya, Asma, and Huda can reflect on how you found and engaged with participants during the course of your research. Asma and Huda, do you want to start?
Yeah, okay. So yeah, I think we had also discussed this during when we were reflecting on our work during the RAINS seminars. I was more about like when we are interviewing individuals, it's more about like letting them speak and like letting them guide the interview and not you being the one who's putting words into their mouths, which I think is very important for researchers, because when sometimes you get too attached to your research or what you're working on, that you tend to get overpowered with your opinions. And we used to ground ourselves and let them speak. Sometimes the questions which were of our which were of like importance to us weren't of that importance to them, and they would simply ignore it or not reflect it in that detail. And I think as a researcher through this process, what both of us have learned is just letting the interviewee guide the research and the interview, and not imposing your thoughts on them. For instance, for us, maybe issues of hygiene and health were very important for the workers, but when we posed such questions to them, for them, they were like, for us, earning a proper wage during that period and ensuring wage security and food security were way higher than ensuring that we sanitize our hands. Even though like for us, it was important, but for them, it wasn't. So it's like letting them guide the interviews. And that's how our relationship with the participants was categorized. I hope I answered the question, and we can hear more from other panelists as well.
Thank you.
I would definitely echo all of that. I think for me, active listening was the most important thing. Being able to listen and allow them to speak. Oftentimes I heard from farmers especially that
like I was the first person who was not a farmer asking them these questions and being interested in their stories and what they had to say. And that to me meant a lot. And then I got so many invites to go visit farms, and I did a lot of them. I couldn't do all of them, but I feel like that is because when you come in without an ulterior motive and your only motive is to listen and to amplify somebody's story, I think that people can feel that, and that can mean a lot more than you think. I think a lot of times it can be the first step to reconciliation and to healing. And so yeah, I would echo everything everyone else said, and also add that I am hoping to bring that also into my daily life as well.
I want to thank you all so much. And I think we're at time. Yes? Okay. Thank you again. Congratulations on your work.
Thank you all.